Alright guys, so today we are going to be talking about the fundamentals of healing for PvE specifically. I'm not going to be talking about PvP in this video, so if you're PvP and you only PvP, then you can go ahead and click off this video. So right off the bat, I want to caveat that I am a DPS main, right? I'm not a healer main. I have 7 years of MMO experience, and over that time I've had the opportunity to learn from multiple healers that were ranked high up on PvE leaderboards and things like that. So I've just had opportunities to learn from some of the best healers that I've met, and they've taught me a lot, right? And also by me being a DPS, that allows me to understand like certain team dynamics that I will get into later. And I also sometimes dabble in tank. Like sometimes I play tank. That way I can get a feel for every role on the team, and it helps me to understand things that I didn't understand when I used to only play DPS. And it kind of like open my eyes and helps me be more open-minded as to what people are going through. Right? So the first thing we're going to talk about, right, is the healing mindset. This is the first thing that you need to get into your mind, right? So you have to keep yourself alive in order to help other people. Now, there's a but. You can heal yourself in most MMOs, and all the ones that I've played so far, you can heal yourself a lot easier and a lot quicker than you can heal your teammates. So you need to be able to judge who needs to be healed first. You need to be able to read the situation, and if you are like half health and a teammate's half health, then more than likely, situation dependent, you're probably going to want to heal your teammate first, and then because you can heal yourself a lot easier, and you can do that later when things are not as hectic, right? So you need to keep yourself alive, but don't be that healer that's too busy healing themselves while everyone else is dying, right? So that's the first mindset. Because and the reason this is important is because a lot of new healers, like people that main heal, tend to share particular like psychological aspects. Like it's kind of a psychology thing, and typically, not all the time, but typically your healer mains are the few females that play MMOs. Sometimes they play other things, and there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of times, like, chances are, if you meet a female in an MMO, they're probably playing a healer, right? And obviously guys do it too. I'm a guy. But the thing is, people that tend to main heal have the mindset where they really want to help other people. And it usually ends up being so much so that they get too busy helping the other people, helping their teammates and healing their teammates, that they forget to pay attention to their own health, and next thing they know, they died, and they're caught like they didn't even really know they were low health, because they just want to help, right? And that's a good thing, but again, like I said, you need to be able to keep yourself alive in order to keep others alive. So the next thing we're going to talk about is understanding team dynamics, right? And I touched on this a little bit at the beginning, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth into it. So what am I talking about? Now this is particular, I made like a little list of just relationship between healer and DPS. Obviously there's tank. Tank is an important role, and it is a part of most teams, but it kind of applies similarly. Adding tank into this list would just make it longer, right? So I kind of didn't include tank. So if you have good DPS and a good healer, right? If the DPS know their healer is good, they know they can trust them, right? And said DPS is a skilled, experienced DPS, right? Then that DPS is going to willingly take more hits so that they can do more damage, because they know they can trust their healer to heal them through that, right? So if the healer is good and the DPS are good, people are going to take a little bit more damage than normal. Not a whole lot. You need to be smart about it, right? Because again, the DPS has to be skilled, right? I'm not talking about people that don't know mechs. I'm talking about knowing the mechs and knowing which ones that you can afford to get hit by, and that you can trust your healer to heal through, right? So good healer, good DPS, you're probably going to see a little bit more damage taken. Maybe, maybe not. Situation dependent. Typically, if you have good DPS, but a bad healer or a new healer, then the DPS are going to do everything they can to avoid getting hit at all, because they cannot trust the healer to heal them. They might, have some healing potions to heal themselves, but for the most part, they're not going to. They're going to try their best to not get hit at all. So sometimes that can lead to misconceptions. People might think, "Oh, nobody got hurt, nobody died. I must be a really good healer." And sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it can lead to misconceptions, right? Then we have bad DPS, but good healer. Okay, the healer's experienced, they know the mechs, they know priorities, right? So if they're bad DPS, if they're new DPS, they don't know the dungeon, things like that, then obviously they're going to need to be babysat. They're going to take lots of damage. They're going to take even more damage than if they're a good DPS, because these people don't know they don't know the mechs, they don't know which ones they need to dodge, or they don't know to dodge, right? So they end up taking a lot of damage. Sometimes so much so that you can't even, you can throw all the heals in the world and sometimes they're still going to die, right? That's just how the cookie crumbles. Sometimes there's people that are beyond your help as a healer, even if you have maxed out gear score. Then you have bad DPS and bad/new healer. And what that's going to lead to is people are going to be dying everywhere. They're going to be dying left and right. And usually the healer is going to be the one to suffer, right? The healer is going to be blamed, and they're going to get kicked when it's a little bit of everyone's fault. I'm not saying the healer is innocent, because in this situation they are not. They are inexperienced, but those DPS are also making mistakes. But most people don't want to admit that they're wrong, or they try to blame anything and everything on someone else, right? So typically the healer is the first one to suffer, and suffers the worst in groups that do not mesh well, or are not perhaps skilled enough to be doing the content, or skilled may not even necessarily be the right word. It may just be a lack of experience in general. So now we move on to understanding and knowing the dungeon, and then reactive versus proactive healing. Now I'm going to start with the dungeon part, right? So knowing the dungeon mechanics is really important. Now, obviously, to run the dungeon, pretty much everybody needs to know the mechanics. But the healer, and typically the tank in most games, the healer needs to know the mechanics like the back of their hand, and they need to know even the small things. Like, usually when a new dungeon comes out, there's one or two, maybe three big, obvious mechanics that are kind of the key to that dungeon, right? But then you have the small things, like the attack patterns, stuff that the mini bosses do, or the bosses that come before the final boss, the mobs, stuff like. You need to know the tiny things too. You need to pay attention to this. Now, figuring that out does take time. You need to, everyone has to start somewhere. You have to learn at some point, right? You have to run these dungeons over and over, but you need to pay attention, right? You learn the key mechanics, but then don't just turn your brain off, right? As you keep running through, you get more comfortable. Start paying attention to those little things, like attack patterns and stuff. And I'll give some examples here in a bit. So as far as reactive versus proactive healing goes, what do I mean by that? So typically your new healers and your less experienced healers will kind of sit there and do nothing, more or less. Maybe they know to buff and debuff and stuff. Maybe they know to throw some buffs and debuffs out on the boss, right? But other than that, they kind of sit there and don't do anything until someone gets hurt, and then they panic. So someone gets hurt, they throw all of their heals at this one person, right? They'll throw the focus heal, they'll throw out an AoE heal. Sometimes a lot of times they'll panic, right? And they'll throw everything out. Then all of their heals are on cooldown, and then something else happens. Somebody gets hurt, a mechanic comes up, and typically there's like more than one person needs to be healed now, and they can't do anything because their heals are already on cooldown. And so then they panic more. They start to lose. It's kind of a compounding effect. This causes them to panic even more. They start losing control of the fight. Alternatively, you have inexperienced healers that overheal. You know, people may be like full health, and then they might lose 500 HP out of 20,000. And these people will see that tiniest sliver of health, and they'll throw out a heal. Sometimes, usually, the people that I'm talking about will throw out a big heal just for that little bit. And it has the same effect where now that really effective heal that you could have had in your inventory is on cooldown, and something bigger occurs, and now you kind of need it and you don't have it. So it leads to the same effect. Kind of the opposite, like they might be kind of overactive, like they're trying to do too much, and it leads to the same effect, right? Now there is a way, like there are like sub methods of healing where sometimes you want to overheal, but I'm not going to talk about that at this very moment just so I don't confuse people, right? So those are examples of reactive healing. You know, people kind of sit there and they wait for something to happen, and then they try to like hurry up and scramble to like heal that person, and it, depending on the difficulty of the dungeon, you can lose control of the fight very quickly doing that, right? So what do I mean by proactive healing? What is proactive healing? Proactive healing is predicting and preparing for what's coming next. And that's why this is also in the section of knowing the dungeon. In order to do this effectively, you have to know the mechanics, right? So if you know what's coming up next in the fight, you know what the attack patterns are of the boss and all those good things, then you are able to predict the fight, right? So you can save those big heals, or you will know, like, okay, this person got hit by a small auto attack and he lost 500 HP. I'm not going to heal him just yet, because in about 15 seconds he's going to do an AoE attack where it is likely that multiple people are going to get hurt, and they're going to get hurt for way more than 500. So I'm going to hold on to my heals until that happens, and then I will heal them. Because ultimately, like, you know that nothing's really going to happen between that person losing a small little bit of health and the big mechanic. And if you, depending on your experience, you'll also be able to judge if that person has enough health to wait or not. There's a lot of small things that start to go into it. But the key thing is being able to know what's coming up and preparing ahead of time. And again, I will include some examples here in just a bit, right? But this is just to kind of talk about the steps first, right? So the next thing I want to touch on now is steps to healing a random dungeon. I will kind of touch on a static group in a bit. If you know what that is, great. If you don't know what that is, I'll explain it a little bit later. So this is kind of like things that, like, this is what's running through my mind when I queue up and I join a random group for a dungeon, right? The very first thing I do when I get into a random dungeon with people that I don't know is I use the early and or small fights to figure out who gets hurt the most, so I know who to keep an eye on. Sometimes that might be nobody because the group is really good. Sometimes that might be everybody because the group is relatively inexperienced or unskilled. And most of the time you'll have like one or two people that tend to get hurt more than the others, or maybe that they have slightly less gear, so like every little hit they take actually hurts them a little bit more, kind of deal. Like it's a bigger percentage of their overall health. You know, there's complicated math that I'm not going to touch on there, right? But you know, most of the time you'll notice one or two people tend to like lose health easier than the others, right? So you're going to be you're going to be watching people's health bars, right? And you're going to be looking for people that are getting hurt a lot. That way, once you get to the big fight, you're like, okay, I need to kind of keep an eye on this person because they're probably going to get hit a lot, and you'll prioritize them with healing up to a certain extent. If they're like completely brain dead and you can tell they're just a complete detriment to the team, sometimes you might have to take your losses and like you might have to not focus him in order to keep the other people alive. But that's going to be kind of a niche situation. That's just a judgment call that will have to be taken with experience, and like you'll just kind of learn as you go, right? That's the first step. Second step is to try and judge how fast the monsters die. Try to judge the DPS of your group. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, it's not for ego, and it's not to judge the people that are in your group specifically, but it's so that you can decide when you need to apply buffs and debuffs. Now, depending on the MMO you're playing, that might not necessarily apply because you're like, oh, well, I just use my buffs off cooldown. I debuff off of cooldown because that's the best thing. And I've played games where that is the case. However, in Throne and Liberty, as I am using as an example here, that is not necessarily the case. And what I mean by that is, if you can tell that the mobs are like, the small individual monsters, if you can tell that those are dying super fast, you don't want to use a bunch of your buffs and debuffs on the mobs, because they'll still be on cooldown when you get to the mini boss, right? And the mini boss obviously takes a little bit longer, so you want to make sure your buffs and debuffs are available for the mini boss. So that's what I mean by like you want to judge the DPS so that okay, maybe I don't want to use my buffs just yet. They're kind of killing it pretty quick even without my help. I'll help them on the mini boss. Things like that, right? Then for step 3, and this is kind of not real. I don't know. I really wanted to mention this. I want to make sure this was mentioned. So I don't know if it really counts as a step or not. It's just something you need to do, right? And that is manage your heals, right? I talked about it on the reactive and proactive healing section, right? You don't want to overheal, and you don't want to underheal. And some of you may be thinking, yeah, duh, right? But like, what does it actually look like? Sometimes, if you're familiar with the dungeon, you might know like, okay, I want to make sure everyone's topped off before we get to this point. And then other times you're like, okay, I know nothing's gonna really happen for a few seconds, so I'm not gonna do a whole lot here, right? And also, like I talked about prioritizing 1 or 2 people that get hurt a lot, right? Depending on how familiar you are with the group, and you'll see this more in static groups. I'm still going to talk about that individually later, right? But real quick, if you know what it is, basically, if you're more familiar with the people you're running with, or the fight has lasted long enough that you feel like you have a good judgment, right? Typically this is like with tanks, right? Say you have a really beefy tank, and you have a really beefy tank. Like, he just has a ton of health, or he takes no damage, and say you're like 5 minutes into a fight, and the tank is half health, and then you see a DPS that gets knocked down to half health in like 1 hit. You are going to want to heal that DPS first, because you know that you can trust that tank to not die from 1 random hit while you're taking the time to heal the DPS. And hopefully the tank can trust you to know that you will get to him eventually, but you have other priorities right now, right? Goes back to team dynamic and trust and all of that whatnot. So, and this is where, when I talked about playing DPS and playing all the roles, this is where some of those misconceptions could come in, right? Because I've seen situations like exactly like what I gave an example of. I give this example because I've seen it happen to where DPS or tanks or like someone in the group, right? They get butthurt because the healer is taking a really long time to give them heals, and they're like, oh man, I was sitting at half health for like 30 seconds. Well, first of all, did you die? No. Second of all, assuming the healer knows what they're doing, the healer might not, but I've seen it I've seen it happen to where the healer did, in fact, but where the healer was a good healer, right? If the healer's a good healer, they're probably prioritizing other people that they know are going to die if they don't help them first, right? And so, in a way, it's kind of a compliment to that DPS. It's like, okay, I can trust you to live a little bit longer while I help these other people, right? But that DPS got butthurt because he's never played a healer. He doesn't know the dynamics of what's going on. And so he thinks that healer is like bad, and then there may be trash talking. They may try to kick him, all kinds. I've seen everything, right? So that goes back to playing different roles helps you understand the struggles and strengths of the different classes and roles, even if you don't main it, right? Again, I'm a DPS main. I don't main heal. I've just been lucky enough to learn from some really good healers over the years. And then I dabble in tank just so I can make sure that I understand what the tanks are experiencing as well, right? That way I can understand everybody's point of view and I know what they're dealing with. So then we have step 4, which is go over the mechanics in your head and kind of start mentally, start getting a game plan ready in your head before you get to the boss. Now, obviously, if you're at this point, that means you've ran this dungeon several times. And honestly, if you've ran it enough, you don't even need to do this. It's just kind of like it's just something you naturally do, right? But if you're kind of new and you're kind of working your way up, you might want to get into a habit of this, right? So you've judged, so you know who's getting hurt a lot, you know who to keep an eye on. You've made a judgment as to how good the DPS of the group is. Managing your heals is neither here nor there. So now you're getting a little bit closer to the boss, right? You want to start planning, based on what you've figured out so far. You're like, okay, I'm going to use my buffs here. This person's probably going to need a little bit of extra help, a little bit of extra heals. So I'm going to keep an eye on them during this part of the boss fight because it's easy to get hurt or something like that. You know what I mean? You want to start kind of getting a plan together. That way you're in control of the fight. And that rolls over into step 5, which is control the fight as much as possible, right? And I'll give an example here in just a second. But once you know the mechanics and you know them really well, right? If there's a way that you can take control of the mechanic in any way, you want to do that. And sometimes it's not necessarily a direct answer or intervention. And I know this sounds weird and vague. I'll give an example in a second. But I'm going to try to verbally describe here as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a recording of me healing this particular dungeon I'm about to talk about. But I'm going to try to give you an example. There's this one dungeon in Throne and Liberty where for mech purposes, certain players will have a cone in front of them. And if they point this cone towards other people, it makes them lose control of their character and usually results in those people getting hurt, right? This is going to be an example of indirect control, where when I'm healing this dungeon, typically the people that get the cone will be the people furthest away. It's kind of random. That's not always the case, but usually the people that are furthest out get picked first. So when I heal that dungeon particularly, I will stand closer to the boss so that I reduce my chances of getting the cone myself. That way I can heal the people that get caught in the cone, assuming that I don't get caught myself. Right? That's a way of indirectly controlling the mechanic, right? Because you're not voluntarily taking the cone, because then you can't actually help anyone, right? You just do the mech. You're kind of intentionally not taking the mech. That way you can help the people that kind of are victims of mess ups and stuff. If hopefully that makes sense. And then I'll use what video recording I do have to show you an example here in just a second. Okay, so let's do a walkthrough of this video that I've had playing in the background so that I can give you guys some examples of what I've been talking about, right? So the first thing I'm doing here when I get into this dungeon, right, I'm looking for that one or two people that are going to get hurt more than the others, right? But also, watch what I do here almost immediately, right? I know that the place we have to go to is around this corner, and I notice that this guy is going to get to the mobs before the rest of us. So I'm already trying to get to his name where I can highlight it so that I can heal him, because I know by the time we get to the mobs, he's probably already going to have taken some damage, right? So I'm already trying to get to his name and prepare to heal him once I do show up, right? You know, and he didn't lose that much health, but you never know, right? It's just kind of preparing and thinking ahead, right? You know, so I'm already getting set up so that I can help him, right? Then you'll also notice that the mobs are dying pretty quick, right? And so when we get to this part, there's only like 2 mobs we need to kill to move on. And so because of that, I don't really do anything here, because I know I don't want to waste my buffs or debuffs, because I mean, you see how quick that we blow through those, right? Then we get to the first mini boss. Now, I judge the DPS. I have all my buffs and debuffs ready to help the team here. Now, you'll see it in a minute, right? But there's a mech this mini boss does to where she'll pull a person in where they can't really move, like they're kind of stuck in front of her, right? And after about 5, it maybe even be 3, like 3 to 5 seconds of her doing that, this person will take multiple heavy hitting attacks. Usually, if I'm like a DPS and I run this dungeon, a lot of times I'll see people get killed by this because the healer isn't like prepared, right? It's not a one shot. That's the key thing, right? It's not a one shot. So if the healer knows the mechanic, right, and they're thinking ahead and they're preparing and they're planning, you can set up your heals to where you are able to out heal the chunks that are taken. Now, usually, even if I do this, the person will still be like low health, but they'll live versus dying, right? I can out heal those ticks of damage only because I'm able to plan ahead and I stack multiple heals. And so you'll see I'm actually the one that got pulled in here. So you see me start stacking my AoE and using this skill called Flash Wave, which heals over time. I'm stacking a lot of my heal over time heals on top of getting prepared to cast my self heal and time that with the chunks of health so that I end up like, you know, out healing the damage and I'm perfectly fine. And then obviously if a DPS or someone, but if anyone else gets pulled in, then you pre-select their name and you basically do the same thing and prepare, you get ready to out heal the damage. Alright, so I'm gonna let this video keep playing just so, you know, there's nothing like, you know, people don't say, oh, I cut a part where I messed up, you know, just so people can't really hold anything against me. I'm gonna let this video play out, which you've probably already been watching it, you know, over the course of the video, but for demonstration purposes, I say unfortunately in terms of demonstration purposes, this group was a pretty good group. No one died. People really didn't take that much damage, so there's not a lot that happens here for a little bit. So I'm going to use this time to kind of go over what I like, a little bit of a recap, basically, right? And so, you know, I remember when I was like first learning how to heal and dealing with all the misconceptions, or realizing that I had misconceptions before as a DPS, and then experiencing misconceptions held by other DPS and other teammates firsthand because they don't understand just like I didn't understand. So that's kind of why I talk about, you know, team dynamic stuff. And also I remember telling a buddy who was a really good healer, I'm like, oh hey, this person's a decent healer, or this person's a decent healer, and he would be like, no they're not, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? And so he, like, one day he pulled a recording of like a person that I had complimented, and he like sat me down and was like, here, watch this video and review it with me. And he pointed out, he's like, look, they're not like, yes, they are healing, but they're waiting until stuff happens. And he pointed out how they would like sometimes lose control of the fight and they were being reactive. You know, they were reactively healing. They weren't proactively healing. And his wording was really good. Though, like, those terms, I get those terms from him, right? I really like his wording, and it helped me understand that concept and helped me to start working towards how to be because that's what really makes a skilled healer and experienced healer. being able to predict and proactive heal. So that's where I get those terms from. I remember experiencing that myself and it being a little bit difficult to understand that without it being explained to me, right? So here we're at the final boss, and you're gonna see a mechanic here in a minute where the furthest person out gets like a ring and it does continuous damage. You know, people can jump in the ring to share damage. That's whatever, right? The point I want to make with this mechanic is to talk about step number 5, controlling the fight. This is going to be an example of active control, what I would term as active control. And I am there's you can't hear it because of the way I have the video set up, but there's a audio cue, like the boss says something to, like, you know, tell you, hey, I'm gonna do this now, and then she does this mechanic and she puts the ring on the furthest person out. So as the healer, I make an effort to try and be the furthest person out at that moment. That way I have the ring, I can control where it goes. And the reason I want to control it, the main reason, is because sometimes there will be ranged DPS that are standing like really far back and they'll get the ring. And then eventually part of the mechanic is everybody that's in the ring kind of gets turned to stone and frozen in place. And then everyone else in the group has to run and jump into it to like avoid getting hit really hard, right? So sometimes ranged DPS will stand really far back and then they won't move. Like they'll stay back there the whole time. So they get frozen like 27 meters away from the boss. And now the melee DPS and the tank are having to run 27 meters. And majority of the time they don't make it. And it results in us taking hits. So in order to avoid that, I try to take control of the ring as the healer. That way I can bring it in closer to the melee for when that mechanic does occur. Now, you've seen me, like, I slip up a little bit. Like sometimes it goes to one of the other range guys, but luckily they're not standing too far in this particular example. So, you know, which here's an example of me making a mistake. Not everyone's perfect, right? We all make mistakes, but you get the idea, right?